All right, so this is a great time to mention the third interplay, which is this attention to detail that emerges during this period and really just increases ever after. And this is something that scientists and artists both are involved in. So people at this point are finally beginning to understand that you can have perspective, and you can have depth, and you can make things, they can go like this and also like this, and they don't all have to look the same within the painting. And so it really draws the viewer in a new way. And there are even details like this. So just very good natural history details that make things look much more realistic and less posed than they used to be in the past. So this is a great example of the kind of artwork that's allowed to emerge after we make these discoveries. The engineers and the artists and everyone working in these fields finally figure out how to do these things with the angles and the geometry. And so now we have this great image where the tiny little birds off in the distance are different size and the great big birds up front. We have little waves back here and big waves up here, and all this movement. And none of this stuff was really possible before. On the right, we have an image, again, from William McGillivray. This is an Osprey, and he was known for really being a stickler for detail. He was such a stickler that not only do we have little spiky feathers off the back of the head, not only do we have each little feather delineated on the back, we even have spicules on the feet. And of course, no birder out in the field is really going to see these all that well unless they have a really great scope, which no one at this time did, or holding the birds in their hands. And so these are examples of people who really just wanted to capture for posterity every little thing about this bird and cram it into a picture so that if you're looking at it, you can have instant knowledge of that bird's morphology. However, there are other things that you can learn about the morphology. For instance, as I said, the Asian art is very interested in capturing the essence of the birds. The picture on the right is from Audubon. That's a Canada goose, obviously. And I think that he is particularly well known for capturing behavioral reality as well. And when you look at this painting, you can practically hear the bird honking because you see the arch of the neck and the way that it's straining forward and its mouth is open. And these are details that we really wouldn't have seen before. It's much more accurate, much more scientific. On the other hand, you can have artists who combine all of this stuff together. So this is a picture from Joseph Wolfe, who is considered to be not just the greatest bird artist of all time, but perhaps the greatest wildlife artist of all time. And he is someone who is known for doing morphological details, behavioral details, landscape accuracy, spiritual accuracy that captures everything about this bird that you can look at in the painting. He's especially well known for doing with larger species. And actually, I do want to mention another instance in which attention to detail is very important. A lot of artists are also, bird artists. They are naturalists because they're outside looking at the birds, and they notice things sometimes that true scientists don't because they kind of see things in a different way. And when Darwin brought back his finches from the Galapagos, he took them to a renowned bird artist of the time, and it was the artist who told him that what he had there was a collection of birds that were highly related. Darwin himself did not realize that independently, so it took an artist's eye to see those details. All right, so the next big step here is the thinking eras, which I have kind of lumped together. This is the Age of Reason and also the Enlightenment. And during this time, we really have this huge boom of scientific study. There are organizations that arise around this. There are publications that are circulating for the first time. We have classification systems. All this communication involved with exchanging information. And so, as people understand things more in a scientific and natural setting, they want to make their overall composition more realistic. And this improves on the last big thing that we saw, which was making the birds themselves more realistic. So now we're also placing the birds into a setting where you would actually find them. And in this kind of new era, we're also shifting away from that traditional symbolism. And this especially happens in the 17th century. So as we know these birds more, as we put them more where they belong, we kind of shift away from making them symbolic of something else and just let them be themselves. So here's, I think, a great juxtaposition to kind of embody that. On the top here, we see these very posed birds looking off into the distance very stiffly in this very strange kind of classical type setting. And it's sort of a strange aggregation of birds also. I mean, not that we wouldn't find these all on the table maybe at dinner time, but they probably weren't hanging out in this lovely courtyard together in real life. On the other hand, on the bottom there, we have all these birds and animals kind of put together in a more realistic, I think, aggregation. Also, they all have much more of a sense of movement around them. They seem to be doing something. They're hanging out in the barnyard. There's much more movement. They're not kind of stuffed looking. And so this kind of represents the shift that we have during this time, to just making things kind of explode off the wall a little bit more. We also have, for the first time, Western artists who are going out into the wild, kind of like the Asian artists have been doing for thousands of years by this point, and they're sitting down and making studies of birds. And so this is a nightjar here on the left, an Indian nightjar. This represents a nice example of a bird that someone went out and just watched in the wild and tried to get a nice idea of, what its morphology would have looked like. On the right is a more accurate example of what most people probably were seeing at the time, because for the most part, even though they were doing this outside, they were probably doing it with dead birds that they had shot or been brought, whether they themselves were in this area or had been brought back something by a traveler. So this is a great example, I think, of what most artists were working with, which was this dead animal that they then had to, in their minds, move around and make look more lifelike. And so it's kind of remarkable that even at this time period, you have animals that look somewhat alive, like this one, a little stiff, but alive, upright. The sun is shining off it in some way that makes the feathers look like that, because the person most likely had to draw this from something like that. So it's pretty impressive that they can create this all in their minds. And this is a nice period of time, all this scientific improvement, to discuss the use of technology. So this is a field, really, technology has pretty much been a one-way street in terms of art. Once scientists have come up with the stuff, artists have really benefited from it. Now it's not just techniques, but it's also getting information out, how they can sit down and look at things in order to create art. So it's really the whole process that's really helped. So for instance, here we have lithographic plates, and the creation of these, which actually did occur during this time period, was hugely influential later on, especially during Audubon's era. Over here is a camera obscura, which would have been used to transpose that big image into a little one that you could just trace around, making it much easier to reproduce something. Cameras, of course, also binoculars. Both of these things, well, binoculars were actually first developed during this time period in their original form, not in what we consider to be binoculars today. Camera came slightly after. The creation of paper obviously occurred a much longer time ago, but this is the time when we finally have sheet paper presses, so that you can have the bulk production of lots of paper, so that people can get stuff out once they've created some artwork. However, there are a couple instances we can find through time where artists have benefited scientists in the realm of technology. So this is probably instantly recognizable as the work of Da Vinci, because we all know that he was very interested in his flying machines. So he had, both a scientist and an artist perspective. And being someone like that, he was able to look at birds and watch how they moved and make studies of their wings and their movements, and then try to figure out a human device that would allow us to do the same thing. Now, we know that ultimately he was not successful in this, but a lot of his work did lay the foundation for what we were able to come up with later. So it's a pretty impressive feat for someone all these hundreds of years previous. All right, so that technology slide is a nice segue into the Industrial Revolution. Now, this is a time when there were some really conflicting ideas about the human situation. People were really excited about all the new stuff they were coming up with, but at the same time, they were really upset about the darkness of the cities, the sootiness, people crammed in together, the feeling caged, feeling that man was hurting nature. And so we have this kind of interesting pull back and forth between the pastoral and the urban. There's a lot of romanticism attached to anything that has to do with the countryside, and a lot of negativity attached to anything that has to do with the urban areas. This is also the time, and I would say that this pretty much eclipses anything else that was produced in terms of bird art. This is the time of Audubon and all the other naturalist artists that came before and after him.